Hello, good morning. Um, I'm happy to present the Northeastern Game Speaker Series. We are going to have a speaker every month for this semester until April. I'm Nathalie Matte. I'm the coordinator for the Game Science and Design program in Oakland, at the Oakland campus. We also have a program in Boston. So I will let James Cobb talk to Emily. We are pleased to have Emily today and enjoy.
Yeah, hello, and yeah, thank you for coming. Um, I'm excited to have Emily here to talk today. Emily is a Chicago-based multimedia artist, writer, and community organizer interested in the intersection of folk games, philosophy, and education. She acts as the event producer at Night City and is an adjunct professor of game development at DePaul University. She has a background in working at summer camps. She frequently travels to different game festivals and events to run folk game workshops. I'm excited to hear about a little bit of those too. And she's also worked at the NYU Game Center, Tender Claws, Babycastles, and at the MAGFest Indie Arcade. Um, so yeah, Emily, I will hand it to you if you'd like to take it away.
Amazing. Thank you so much, James. And thank you, Northeastern, for inviting me. Could you possibly give me permissions to share my screen on the Zoom? Oh, there we go. Thank
Yes,
you
I think I
so
just gave it.
much. Okay, cool. So, um, yes, thanks again for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I love talking about my work and folk games. And so today, when James invited me to give this talk, I decided today that I would discuss sort of how my career has been shaped, since I figured there might be some students in the audience. And I kind of have a weird, an atypical career path, as well as how I've realized that so much of my work has been shaped by how bored I've been in my life and my relationship with boredom, and how that's been like a really important perspective for me as someone who works in games. And so I'm happy to talk about all this with everyone. So again, yeah, my name is Emily. James very kindly read out my bio. My pronouns are she, her. Um, I just started calling myself a multimedia artist because all my little descriptor words got too long, so I figured that was a nice umbrella. But yeah, I consider myself a game designer, a writer, an educator, and community organizer, first. And I'm known by the most pertinent part of my reputation, I think, amongst my friends who work in games, is about my work in folk games. I get invited to games festivals and events to run folk games workshops, which is like one of the most fun, rewarding things I never thought I could get paid for, but I have a lot of opportunities. I've been to like 5 different countries to run these workshops. And if you're wondering what folk games are, I'll give you the definition that me and some of my colleagues usually use to understand what we're talking about. We're talking about folk games since it's a pretty broad term, folk culture. It can refer to a lot of different things, a different it's referring to like a way that culture comes to be, which can encompass, card games. It can encompass a lot of things, but the way that we like to talk about folk games has 4 principles. The first is that usually the entire rules can be explained by one person from memory. They're simple rule sets that you also um, learn by word of mouth. So they're not going to be things that you need like a really extensive rule book for. And because of that, they're also not usually designed by a single person, or they don't have a known origin, since when things are being passed by word of mouth, all those details kind of slip through the cracks. So they're games that kind of just like pop up and then are passed around. Um, Additionally, like I said, usually passed by word of mouth. They're because they have simple rule sets, and they don't have a lot of formalities to them. They're shared through different experiences with people, from one person telling another person, teaching people these games, and carrying on those games. And lastly, they usually can be played with little to no materials And if they do require material items, it would be things you can find around the house. So like paper and pen, maybe a ball, nothing that you would have to go out and purchase in order to play them. So I gained this reputation in folk games, in part because of summer camps. When people meet me, sometimes they tell me that I give camp counselor vibes, which is must be true because I've worked at summer camp since I was 14. So I have an extensive anthology of folk games in my brain, that I can whip out at a moment's notice to entertain a large group of students. So there's a very practical reason for me to learn all these games. And it actually is still a big part of my income. I work for the National Student Leadership Conference. I used to be the program director of their game design program, in which James has been one of our guest speakers for the last couple of years. And now I work as an assistant site director. So I'm basically like the vice principal of summer camp, overseeing like all the things that go on in our academic programs. I also have this association with folk games because I grew up somewhere super boring, and I'm pretty vocal about that. So I grew up in the south suburbs of Chicago in a town called Frankfurt, which like if you look at the map, it's literally where like suburb meets corn. So there was absolutely nothing to do there. And there were hardly any third spaces, no public transit. I couldn't afford a car. There was a lot of like smoking weed in parking lots and walking around Walmart, and that was kind of my teenage experience was being bored in our hometown, like trying to find things to do. And so naturally, when we didn't have anything to do and we didn't have any money, my teenage friends and I gravitated toward folk games as kind of the antidote to our boredom. Or how I like to describe, we got really good at being bored, which means to me, really good at making something out of nothing. This is a video, a little gif of one of my best friends when we were teenagers, like at the local Meijer, which is like grocery store, department store. Um, and we would just hang out at stores because that's all there were and find like weird ways to interact, playing hide and seek, just messing with things in the aisles. I promised you we cleaned this up. We weren't trying to make any staff's lives worse. But you know, we were teenagers hanging out in public, doing chores together, running errands, and we became really good at making those mundane things interesting to us. So like things that might typically be banal, like sitting in a basement, going and grabbing like cleaning solution from the store for our moms. Like we would turn those errands into like the time of our lives just because we were so oriented to the nothingness of our environment that we became really creative and good at making things interesting in spaces that typically didn't have a lot to do. So then I went to college at the NYU Game Center. Um, Here's a video that I will not play the sound of like a skit I did turning everything about games into boats. And so I went to school here and I knew I wanted to write dialogue for video games. Like I wanted to be a writer. I was deciding between film and TV and games, and I was like, games are a newer medium, whatever. So I'll go and study video games. So I majored in game design and I minored in philosophy and I minored in computer science and mathematics. The kind of to give this comprehensive view of games and games culture. But as I was in school, I realized that I was learning about New York City. I had never been there before I moved, and I was talking to my classmates about games, and I realized that not everyone had the same upbringing as I did, which is obvious, but when I grew up in this little the bubble of the suburbs, I didn't realize how diverse of an upbringing you could have. I thought everyone was bored in the suburbs, like playing games at grocery stores. And so when I would talk to my classmates about games and my fundamental experience with games being folk games, either from camp or like with my friends at home, I found that not a lot of my classmates had that same attitude toward games and didn't find the same things interesting. Since to me, games were this like social practice to combat boredom, and a lot of people were there because they loved like League, like they loved like real-time strategy games and wanted to like make their own. And I started to feel kind of a disconnect, and realize that my perspective was maybe more unique than I thought as I started meeting diverse people. And as I met more people and learned these more perspectives, I started wondering about how, even in our different environments that we grew up in, how we played differently, but also how we played the same. And so I started to learn more about game design through this program. And as I did, I began to question how the way I played growing up was impacting how I understood just how games work and how game design in general can be used to, create different affects. So I got really interested in house rules, and essentially like the way that your family plays Monopoly is different than how mine plays, the little details that that are a part of our, like a really natural part of playing games with a group of people, how we interpret rules, and how that's different everywhere you go depending on who you play with. And that was so important to me and my friends. So I was like, I wonder how this applies to other play communities. Are there any rules? Are there differences? Like, how can I understand this? And so I began reading more games academic texts as I continued my studies. And part of my one of the biggest revelations for me was understanding the relationship between play and values. Mary Flanagan writes, all games express and embody human values, from notions of fairness to deep-seated ideas about the human condition. Games provide a compelling arena where humans play out their beliefs and ideas. And so I was learning how we as game designers infuse our values into the systems we make. And when we play games, we explore and challenge those values. And that felt really related to how me and my friends had sort of expressed our values through the kind of playful mindset that we had as we were going about our hometown, finding weird experiences to do and things to play with. I also was introduced to the work of Bernie DeKoven, who is like my game design or games in general hero. If you've never read his work, I highly recommend it. He is an extremely influential person for me, since he also was interested in this type of play and it's so articulate in how and why this type of play is important in different mindsets to apply toward games as a community plays them. He was a part of the New Games movement, which was a movement that started in San Francisco in the 60s, but gained more traction in the 70s. It was a response to Vietnam, the opposition to Vietnam, and a lot of the people who were part of this movement were concerned about how, or they wanted a different way to express the kind of energy and aggression that comes out through war. And they had this theory that like peace isn't about sitting around, like the alternative to war isn't going to be like a kind of tranquilness. Instead, like we still have this energy that we need to exert. And so why don't we do it through these sort of really physical, team-based competitive exercises? And so this like idea of thought is responsible for the modern American physical education curriculum. So if you went to like public schools in the US, probably from like the 80s onward, you experienced some of these ideas from the new games movement and how uh, PE used games as part of their, understanding of being physical, understanding of um, culture and building community. This is a picture of a game called Slaughter, which like the whole point of this game is you push this giant ball over to your opponent's side and you're just trying to keep it on the other side of the group. And so, yeah, it emphasized collaboration, competition, moving, and playing. And Bernie was at the forefront of that. But he also wrote this book called The Well-Played Game, which is like my games Bible. I love this book, the most important thing I've ever read about games and play. And in it, he stresses the importance of the way a game is being played over the game itself. When we think about games from a player perspective, we should think about how they might play it. So this theory decenters winning and games rules and recenters the play community. The way a well-played game to him is a game that becomes excellent because of the way it's being played. And he like highlights how when you think about games this way, we should be pro cheating. Like if I'm having a bad time playing a game, but if I like cheated a little bit, I can be more invested in the game. Like why not? If the game is for us to have fun and be engaged, we should be able to cheat. Same with like handicaps. Like if we're playing ping pong together and you're like an expert and I'm really bad at ping pong, then maybe you use your non-dominant hand, or I get like an extra start or something. That we should shape the games based on who's playing them rather than have this like almighty adherence to the game's rules and have a referee that's maintaining those rules, because ultimately the game's for us, it's not for anyone else. So he was pro hint giving, and he also was which as a camp counselor, this is something that's obvious but I never like read or considered explicitly, but that games are consent driven. You can't play with other people if they don't agree to play. And so like, you know, with students in the classroom setting, oftentimes it's like, all right, we're playing a game, everyone has to participate, and we get a participation grade. But actually, like, if someone doesn't want to participate in the game, there's no way that they can reap the rewards of playing that game. Like, you have to just make that something that people opt into in order to have a well-played game. Because no one, if a game is based on how someone's playing, if someone doesn't want to play, they're not going to be able to play that game effectively. In this book, a quote from Bernie, you'll discover that what's new about these games is the way you play them. You can choose to compete because competition is fun, not because you're concerned with who wins. If you've all played hard and enjoyed it, then you've all won. You can change the rules if you don't like them, so long as you all agree on what's fair. You can make the game into whatever you want it to be. So essentially, his framework encourages players to put the play community before the game itself in order to play well or have a collectively fulfilling experience. And one of the main avenues to do this is changing the game to fit your community's needs and play styles, which is what house rules are all about, having particular ways of approaching the game based on what the community's needs are and desires are, how they want to play the game and engage with each other. So I began thinking, and I was like, if games are spaces, we express our values through play, and if we want to play well, we have to honor the play community over the game itself, the people who are playing the games. Then yeah, house rules are this perfect way for people to connect and share values, and maybe we should start designing with the implementation of house rules in mind. So I took this class in undergrad where I had to do a research project related to games. And since I knew I wanted to study house rules, I knew I wanted to do something with folk games, but also I was 19 and wanted to be edgy. And what is the coolest, edgiest game littered with house rules? That's right, beer pong. And so when I would go visit my friends from home who were at state schools here in the Midwest, I realized the way that we played games like beer pong were super different than what we were doing at, in our tiny apartments in NYC. And I also felt, as I was going through my college experience and I was living in New York City for the first time, I was growing and changing and meeting like so many diverse people. But I still felt so bonded to my friends who were having very different experiences, staying in the Midwest in smaller towns. And I felt that a big part of that bond and that strong connection was because the way that we played games together, and that games were such a central focus to how we related to each other. So in the first class, I decided to start this research. I did a survey. I asked people questions about beer pong and found that people had dramatically different ways of even thinking about the game. One of the questions I asked was, what is the goal of the game? And it had like, I don't even know how many different answers. People had so many different interpretations for even the goal, which usually, when you explain the rules of a game to someone, you start with like, what is the goal? And I was like, it's so interesting that a game this simple's goals are so lofty. Some people were like, you want to run the table the whole night. You want to get the ball in the cup. You want to get as drunk as possible. There were all these different kind of like social ideas and um, goals at play that I was finding through the survey, and I realized how vastly different an approach to a game is going to affect how the people playing the game play it. So the next semester I wanted to continue this research, so I did a very low budget experiment since I wanted to test if we can design ways for players to create house rules and exert their own values through play, just like I was kind of noticing was happening in beer pong based on people's accounts of it in my survey. So each session consisted of 4 friends who had been friends for at least 2 years and frequently played games together, so effectively a play community. I gave these friends 20 cups, 2 ping pong balls, and a 6-foot table, and had to get someone else to buy a case of beer because I was underage. So I fortunately got someone to buy some beer for me, and then I instructed this group of friends to play beer pong the way they knew how. Um, and I documented the process in which, like, what rules they were going to use based on their former experience with beer pong, how that conversation kind of came to be, what rules they ended up defaulting on, that kind of negotiation process that comes when you're playing a game with a new group of people. Then, after that first round, I took away the table and I instructed them again to play beer pong the way they knew how. And so now all of a sudden, this play community had a design problem, which was the table was missing. And so they had to figure out a way to play beer pong in the space in whatever way they wanted to. So this is some gifts from that experiment. Unsurprisingly, each group played traditional beer pong by throwing balls into cups to make the other team drink. But each session varied greatly in the supplementary rules they adhered to. Things like do you remove a cup immediately or do you wait for both players to shoot? All the kind of nuances of little rules like Ring of Fire, which is a rule that if you get all the corner cups of the pyramid and the center cup and leave just a ring, you automatically win. All these little touches were different amongst every test group. And there were a lot of different play styles too in this approach. And so then this particular group, when the table was taken away, they decided to go to the ground and bounce the ball into the cups on the floor and kind of created their own arrangement. So their instinct was to go to the ground. But other groups had more or had different approaches. Like this group decided to take another game, Ninja, and combine that with beer pong. Since they no longer had a table, they were like, okay, let's see what we can do if we evoke the rules of these other games that we know. And so there were a lot of very different approaches to playing this game that it's pretty straightforward and everyone was familiar with. But now, given the license to change, had all different kinds of ways of playing and understanding what was going on. But still, throughout this whole process, there was never a question that the game would revolve around anything other than throwing a ball into the cup. That was clear. There was this like design conceit that everyone adhered to and nobody questioned, but there was a lot of freedom to do things beyond that. So I developed this kind of framework. I found that 11 out of the 12 participants of this study found they enjoyed the game they created more than the traditional beer pong. And I was like, well, that might be telling because, it could be because they had drunk more beer by the time they did that second round, but also I think they all enjoyed having this kind of negotiation design process in order to make the game more customized to what their play group enjoyed and being able to like welcome that experience into their play community. The act of collaborating and developing rules personal to them enhanced the player's experiences and relationship with both the game and each other. And when I started considering this from the design perspective, I realized that we as designers have the power to connect people by presenting them an opportunity to solve a design problem, to create their own house rules. So this was the framework I developed. If you take a mechanic, so like putting ball into a cup, the thing that was never questioned, you give everyone a design problem to solve that's related to that central mechanic. You get this kind of like mutable design, is what I called it, this ability to change the design as a play community in order to best fit your play community's values. Relating this back to two of the most important game design lessons that I find the hardest to teach as a professor. One, criticism. that part of being a game designer is being able to play another person's game and articulate what is effective about that design and what they're achieving and what isn't. Bennett Foddy was a professor when I was at the Game Center, and when I started teaching at the Game Center, he was mentoring me and he gave this advice in teaching students game development. I try to impress on them that giving design critique is the main thing real game developers do all day, and being good at it will be the difference between being successful and unsuccessful. But so far, I'm not sure I've ever succeeded at convincing anyone of this, which is now not true because I believe this as well, that being able to articulate what's going on in a game, the kind of skills that we do need as a designer, when we are talking to each other, when we're engaging with our own work, is really important and sort of difficult to encourage students to do. As well as number two, that everything is design. As designers, say it in cursive, these are all levers that we pull when we're designing something, be it if we're making a video game, sound design, visual design, UI, there's the writing, there's the narrative, there's the music, there's the materials that you use, there's all these things that combine into this cocktail to create a player experience. In order to be effective with what we want the player to experience, we should be intentional with all of these levers, even if that intention is creating ambiguity to maybe create a design problem for players to solve. So games, our systems, every piece of it is interconnected. So we, as designers, are good at looking at all the parts of something and assessing what it makes when they're all put together, which is another thing I found students struggling with, that like all of these parts are important. If you have a goal that you want to achieve in your design, you need to look at all of these pieces and how all these pieces relate to each other in order to achieve that goal. And when I started reflecting back on my time in high school and my experience of playing with my friends, I realized that boredom was simply a design problem. Like we had, all of these mechanics in our day-to-day life, but we didn't know necessarily what to do with them. And so we as game designers have all the tools to solve a design problem. And solving a design problem is actually a really bonding, and creative, and fun experience. It allows you to look at new affordances for the parts of your game. When I talk about affordances, I mean all the ways a game element can be used. So like, for example, for a deck of cards, every card has a color, black or red, a value that's going to correlate to a number or a face card. There are numbers and face cards, which are two distinct kind of parts of the deck. The cards have a shape, usually a rectangle. They can be shuffled into a deck or held in your hand. You can have them on the table in front of you, face up or face down. You can give them to another player or discard them out of the game. These are all affordances of cards. And affordances can be social and cultural, not just physical. So like the heart in the suits is also something that means love, that means like connection. There's all these different ways of using the items, the materials, whatever the parts of your games. And when you're bored, that's when you start like finding weird affordances of things. That's when you start like throwing cards at the wall. Like that's when you start folding things up and crumbling them and experiencing interacting with things in ways that you wouldn't normally because you've run out of things to do. And so being bored is a process of exhausting other ways of thinking and discovering new ones. The process of like getting out of boredom is like a really rewarding way of having different ways of thinking about things. Like, for example, this is tic-tac-toe. This game is boring. We don't like it because it's solved. It's, maybe every once in a while it's worth playing if you're, waiting for your food at a diner. But if we look at tic-tac-toe for like 1 minute without changing the central mechanic, can you think of ways to fix tic-tac-toe? Maybe you expand the board. Maybe you add another kind of symbol. Maybe you can erase symbols. There's so many different ways of altering a game if you just like give yourself the space to change it. So I kind of revamped my earlier framework and realized that like if you take a mechanic and you apply boredom to it, you get magic since you can look at this mechanic in ways that you wouldn't typically look at it. And when you're comfortable with being bored, you're willing to sit and fight through the kinds of uh, uh, usual ways of thinking to find some weird lateral ways of approaching the design of a situation. You're comfortable experimenting and discovering new affordances for the parts of your games. The more creative your design solutions will be if you embrace boredom and kind of let yourself practice working your way out of these bored situations. And you'll be able to find ways to play with everything around you, different ways of evoking all of the parts of your environment. Because ultimately, everything is play. Like, I think something I was fortunate enough to just inherently understand growing up because everything was boring was that everything had the potential to be playful and fun. The only thing standing between you and playing is that design problem of boredom. So this was ideas were so important to me, and I had all the tools to make a video game after going to game design school. So I decided to make a video game about being bored and about having so little to do, the ways that we gamify our environment. I also was interested about how the stereotype of the Midwest is that we're all really passive aggressive and bad at communicating, which I found true upon reflecting upon my upbringing. So, but at the same time, I felt like so deeply connected to my friends, even though we maybe, when we were teenagers, we didn't have the skills to communicate how much we meant to each other or exactly what was going on in our lives and the support we needed, because we had this baseline of boredom and playfulness. We developed this intimacy that was like its own kind of care, even though we couldn't communicate with words. And so I decided to make a game about it, which I'll show you the trailer of quickly. What do you think it would be about?
For daily in our lives in a movie, it would be boring.
So all of these little, I wanted to put in a video game explicitly all of these little things that we played with when we were teenagers, like making nachos, hitting the remote on a TV, and show all, like in the context of a video game, how these are all tiny little mini games that we interact with every day, and that like when that is the center point of your world, that is like the tools that you're given to interact with the things around you in the when you lack autonomy as a teenager, that it's really rewarding way of looking at things to approach all these little micro experiences from a playful lens. Um, there we go. And so what's so cool about looking at boredom as solving a design problem, especially like my interest in fostering intimacy, is it extends beyond game design and into how we interact as people when we're designing anything. If we accept that games are embedded with values, we can look at the way a play community might gamify their environment, or create their own house rules and reverse engineer what those house rules are in order to understand the culture of that play community. For example, going back to beer pong, I found that some people played beer pong with like a lot more gendered rules. If you get the center cup, this is a common rule where that's like a punishment if that's the first cup you get because it's the easiest cup. And in some play communities, women would have to do things differently than men. Like women would shoot with their left hand while men had to shoot behind their back. And so a play community that adheres to those rules are probably going to have more strict gender norms than a play community that doesn't. And this applies to like all these things. If people are more lax about cheating, if people are more rigid about how points work, etc., you can look at the way that people want to play and see how that's related to the culture of how these people relate to each other. Which is important because when you understand what design decisions evoke what values, you can use that as a tool to motivate certain player behavior that you want your players to engage with. And I eventually realized that this goes for anything. And because I was interested in the way that people make connections with each other, I started to throw a bunch of parties and running events where I use this framework in order to get people to connect. And I played these games, these kind of folk games that connect people to each other. And so when I was in school in New York still, I started working at Babycastles, which is like a DIY event gallery art space that's really cool. I was invited to go to the Games Arts International Assembly, which is an event that runs every 2 years in a different country with a group of international games curators and community organizers. We discuss like what events are going on, some strategies to engage with the community and bring resources to your communities. And now I work at Night City here in Chicago, where I run playful events as a producer there. This was a picture from a show we ran last March called Idle Arcade, which is all about ambient play, like kind of witnessing play, like watching the DVD logo bounce around a screen and into the corner, and how that in itself is play. This also, after I graduated college, I was fortunate enough to work in other aspects of the video game industry too. I worked at Tender Claws for 2 years, and in that time, worked on these two games, Virtual Reality 2 and the Stranger Things VR game. And I got to learn from Samantha Gorman, who I know was previously a professor here at Northeastern, about her frameworks in engaging with like live theater in VR, which was really influential to me, and sort of led me to my next chapter, which this is my collaborator, Susie Buchan, who is based in Scotland. And together we are the professional dancers because we were interested in how audiences work and like doing a performance art piece and how audiences can interact with performers during in the context of theater and dance. And so we were invited to do a piece at a maze festival in Berlin this past year. This piece was called Pause Play, and we wanted to give the audience a way of interacting with us as the performers. So we made a really basic project where a really basic alt control where the audience essentially has control of the music. We made a playlist. They could pause, play, skip to the next song, go to the previous song, and make the song go double speed or half speed. And then we had to dance to it for 45 minutes straight at the whim of what the audience wanted us to do. Which is kind of the embodiment of a lot of these ideas about giving the audience space to change the rules. That if we can make a performance, but you as the audience get to interact and decide exactly what the values are at play. And we wanted it to become really political, and we weren't sure like what was going to happen, how aggressive people would play with the buttons, but they really came through. Like there was a point where someone grabbed the controller itself and was like, let them rest. And so for 30 seconds, we laid on the ground. Well, that's where they had paused us, and they gave us like a moment to breathe because someone wanted to give us a break in this endurance piece and other people didn't. So it was kind of this like interesting negotiation of play through people pressing buttons and interacting with the game. So the big takeaways here, I guess, that I want to impart with you is that our job as game designers is to create and critique systems, and that when we were bored, we find new affordances and interact with systems in different ways. We become more apt at creating and critiquing systems because we can see these systems from different perspectives. And boredom is this tool that we can use creatively to solve design problems, figure out how to interact with each other, and find new ways of telling stories. My last tidbit of career advice is I never thought I could like any of this is something that could like be a career, could make me money. I could get opportunities through like running folk games workshops, doing performance art pieces. But I found that my like this weird niche interest that none of my colleagues in college really could connect to became the thing that I have become most known for. And I think that's really powerful to consider as you are if you're still in school and you're kind of figuring out like how to shape your career, is that weird thing you can make a space for it. You can kind of if you look around at the job market and you're bored with that, then like figure out a way to incorporate the thing that you do care about into your career. And granted, like the money's not always there. I'm able to support myself also through this work at summer camps, which is related. But this career has allowed me to fund my lifestyle in ways. I'm invited to travel and have all these different experiences at games, festivals and events, and we should consider this kind of like affront to mundanity when we're looking at our careers and like what we want out of games, especially. And thank you. That is all I have for you today.
Yeah, thank you so much. I absolutely love that. I think we're gonna kind of move into a little QA phase. Um, but off the bat, while people are kind of gathering questions, something that really fascinates me is I think we might have spoken about it, but I'm really moving into this space where I think games are more, at least video games are more illusions of play and rule sets than they are actually, just because of the symbolism and bringing over. I never thought about the shared values, but it's just like, oh, I think it should operate this way, so that's the way I'm going to interact with it.
Mhm.
And I was really kind of curious when you're talking about these shared spaces, how much agreements and disagreements you saw between kind of individuals and collective values, and kind of how far that scales out. Like, how do those negotiations take place?
In the sense of like what that process looks like, or what uh how can we account for this on like a micro scale and a macro scale?
I think kind of the first, my thought process is kind of like, are there certain values you see trump other values, or are there certain values that you see like people kind of go to collectively versus individually, or are there individual values that people just are like, we're gonna stick with this regardless if I like it or not?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. So what's cool about this is that like every play community is going to be different. So there is going to, like, in terms of trends overall, um, like a lot of the work that I do is essentially with game designers. So like I've see like how the way game designers approach games, and maybe they have like stricter um way of or like a love for rules sometimes, but also all game designers are different. Like even within that community, some game designers love to cheat, and whenever they play test your game, like they're just trying to like break it. And so it really is different depending on who you're playing with. I think the big thing amongst everyone, regardless it be like in the context of like an individual playing and a group playing, is that when you give people the explicit permission to change things, they're more likely to. And I think that's like important to this framework, is that not only do you have a mechanic that people can start with, you kind of have a constraint for people to work with when they're deciding on just how to change a game, how to experience it, but they also have a like the explicit permission that like you can change the game, because people don't always, their brains don't always go there. So maybe that's one of the biggest differences you see, is like some people like are very, they immediately jump into like, okay, let's do something weird, like I'm playing a social game, I'm like more on that end of things. I want to like push things to their limit, break them. And some people will just like do, will follow the rules as they are. So that kind of communication I found to be really important. Like, okay, no, you can change it. You have to change it because something's broken.
Yeah, that's really cool. Like, it makes me think about I don't know if we've spoken about before, but how Monopoly started marketing that version where it's like the same exact thing, but with that one line of like, it's okay to cheat,
Yeah, it's like a marketing strategy too. Like I'm sure they
right?
spent way more like, or they sold a whole different subset of copies by just like including that in the rules, when like you could just do that with Monopoly.
Yeah.
That is crazy.
Is that something like you kind of run into? Because at least for me, that makes me think of like how they need like an authority, right? Like it's like you need it to tell you.
Yes. Yeah, that definitely is something. Well, it's in the space of folk games, it's interesting because like uh folk games by nature are they're uncommodifiable. you can like develop them into something that is like a packaged game, but ultimately because um they're games that are shared and expressed by word of mouth, that process happens a lot more organically, where like people are asking questions about rules and things, so you get those negotiation processes like very explicitly versus a game that you're going to be handed a rule set, and you have to read and figure out what's going on. So it also is like in the way a game is being facilitated, I feel like is an important thing to consider. Like is someone like the go-to to like ask questions to as we figure out how to play? Are we looking at a rule book? Am I playing a video game? And like I'm looking at like I'm bound by the controls of my keyboard. Um, all these things I think uh are very heavily affect the way people understand what they can change.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm not sure, can you see the chat, or would you like
Yes,
me to
I
read this out?
can. Since you're directed with so many people and have allowed them to be creative in folk games and discuss and design in the spot, do you have a favorite game you've seen a group make on the fly or one that sticks out to you? Thanks. There is a game, well, it's kind of like it is a game that has rules that part of the rules is you have to make your own game. There's this brilliant game that I brought to my theater games for game designers class called Duck Duck Moose, and it's a game where you are allowed to speak any actual language. You can only speak in gibberish, and you give the group of people playing the title of a fake children's game. So like Bear in the Square, like uh toss the rope, like it's something random, and then everyone has to figure out the rules of that folk game together. In like you can discuss in gibberish but you can't actually speak language, and it is like the wildest thing to watch people within minutes create a new game without even speaking to each other. It's like one of the coolest experiences to run, but it's a really delicate game because you have to, for people to like really embrace that game. I've tried to play it with a group of people who like weren't very comfortable with each other yet, and it like did not work. So you have to ease in a play group into playing things, in order for them to have the most effective experience. That's another, I guess, big thing is when you invite people to change the rules, they're going to feel more comfortable and experiment more if they're comfortable with the people they're playing with. That kind of like level of connection really contributes to how effective this design strategy is too. And so if you get a group of people and you like at least play some precursory games for them to feel more comfortable playing with each other, that is like one of my favorites. Duck Duck Moose. It's like brilliant. It's so cool. I've seen some really interesting results in playing that game.
Yeah, I love that. And thanks for the question too.
Mm.
A follow-up to that I'm also interested in is when you speak about comfortability, um I'm not sure if it's as stringent or reliant on this, but do you know if there's a specific level of like self-disclosure that works best for people to be able to open up? Like, do they need to know a little bit of history, or how comfortable do they normally need to be?
That is a really interesting question because they actually like people don't even really need to know each other's names like always. They just have to have like a playing rapport together. So like part something I'm really interested in my practice is like how to design a group experience in order to like slowly up that level of connection and comfortability. And it is just like in order to play a game where you're like gonna be really silly like Duck Duck Moose, you just have to like do that in baby steps. And it's less about like explicit well, obviously explicit communication. Yes, that's a great point. It's about creating that psychological safety, where you are going to where you can start like playing with little things and experiments, feeling that this environment is safe, being explicit about the fact that these games are, you can like opt in or out at any time. You're not pressured or forced to do anything. But otherwise, you don't even really need to like talk to each other. You just need to be able to like inch your way into doing more like silly experiences. And there's a lot of games that are like geared toward, there's a lot of icebreakers. That's like a huge part of uh the like working at summer camp is like getting students comfortable quick. And so it's just kind of that like piecemeal process of being like, okay, we play a game where we're like, I don't know, talking about our like we're creating a story together and we're just talking and like then we can move on to games where maybe we're moving our bodies around a little bit, but we're not like making contact with anyone yet. And you can like work your way up with that, develop that psychological safety through the kind of culture that you're all collectively building and understanding as you're playing more games.
That's really cool. I think another question I have, and if anyone else wants to ask, feel free to just cut me off. I was really curious about when you remove the table from beer pong, because as far as my understanding goes, a lot of folk games they start off a little more complex, and then over time it kind of gets distilled down to like the most simple form, the easiest to kind of transmit to other people and other places. And then of course with like house rules kind of being like the controlling variant based on where you go. What I thought was really fascinating is like you removed this massive um object that's kind of required for what's otherwise a already simple game. And what I started thinking is maybe it's not just like removing things to make it the easiest, but also like convenience of play. Like if people aren't comfortable in sitting on the floor, and I didn't know if you had some kind of feedback or thoughts on that.
Yeah. Um, it is like uh it's interesting because the people are going to interpret like what is necessary for a game in different ways too, because as long I think like that was part of the framework that like you do have to give people a central mechanic. There has to be something that they can cling on to. um Otherwise they'll develop their own convenience, like okay, we're not playing on like I don't want to play on the floor, so I'll try this other thing. And that's like part of that negotiation process is like what are people comfortable with, what do people want to do. They can discuss and shape that accordingly. So like removing the table was like everyone initially, I think they're like their first instinct was to go to the floor, but that quickly changed depending on which group. Like some people ended up with their final iteration of the game being on the floor, but some people like immediately, like you said, like squatted down. Them were like, nope, we're like playing around with this. Um, so it is like that in and of itself, what convenience means and what people feel is like a big part of just what, yeah, what people's expectations are and what they want out of that experience too, and something you can toy around with when you give a group of people like a design challenge to solve.
Yeah, it's I don't know, it's just fascinating because it feels like there's that tension, right? It's like the games are already this kind of unnecessary, like exerted energy towards like kind of a pointless end.
Yeah.
But then you also have this extra thing where it's like, oh, I can't play this game because I don't have this other unnecessary prop that I need for some reason. Yeah, that's just fascinating. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, it's like I think about this a lot with like the bounds and like when you play like Foursquare, the game with you just play like, you know, a rubber ball and you bounce it around each other's squares, and like what that looks like depending on where you're playing. Like um if you're like playing in a city and you don't have like a big blacktop area like you might in like a school playground, those squares are going to look different than if you're playing like somewhere in the suburbs where you just have like boundless concrete where there's no pedestrians or people to interact with that space. It's kind of similar, like what, given what we have, what can we do with it? Do we want to adapt something to something else, or do we want to just like play a game that fits neatly in this space? And it feels like there's a wide variety of both those approaches when people are deciding like what kind of games they want to play.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, thank you again so much. And oh, it looks like Tyler has a final question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi,
Okay,
Tyler.
sorry. Hi, how's it going? I had a question about the psychological safety thing we're talking about.
Mhm.
In that game where you guys were dancing and then people were like changing the song and skipping and stuff. Um, I feel like if I were playing that, I might be a little like overwhelmed or like stressed, like to feel safe to go up and like change something, or like would everybody agree on my decision? Like, am I making a decision that other people aren't interested in? Any kind of like social kind of like struggles, or people who are a little more dominant taking control of things, or like how did you see that dynamic play out?
Yeah, so when we like put it, we weren't sure how people like were going to interact with the buttons, if they were going to like want to come up. And then because we were at this games festival, I think it became like really competitive really quickly. So really only people who were like feeling really dominant, and like someone would be trying to like DJ with it, and someone else would come up and run and like press a button and ruin it. So it was a very much like that kind of experience. And so something that we talked about afterward is we like wanted it to be more open to people who like maybe aren't as aggressive to press the buttons. And so we talked about like how we can design the controller itself. Like if it's on a pedestal where you have steps to go up toward, only like one person can interact with it at a time. If we design it that way, you can make like the sculpture work out of it. But that's also just something that through if that's your design goal is to like let everyone play, those are considerations you can make in like how you shape the space. And so yeah, a lot of people were not able to play it who like didn't want to go up and compete, but that was a big discussion we had afterward, was like, okay, but there are ways we could probably encourage that behavior when we consider this design.
Awesome, thank you.